Evening. I've been told I have 20 whole minutes to do the entire book of Amos, and next week is supposed to be Amos in the New Testament, which we'll see how that goes. What I plan to do tonight is just a Twitter version of Amos, a quick run through of the book with some a little bit of background info, and then probably get to the theology and the message of the book of Amos, and then some of the concepts that the New Testament picks up from Amos and other 8th century prophets in the New Testament. Let me make sure this thing works. What do I point it to? Oh, back there? Okay, I'm not sure what I'm... something worked. Okay, all right. It's always dicey when you get a theologian and technology don't go well together. Let me say just a word quickly about historical background. Most of you are probably already familiar with a lot of this. Amos is one of 4 8th century prophets, 5 if you count Jonah. Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah, along with Jonah. Amos is a Judean who prophesies in North Israel around 760 BC. This is at a period when for about 50, 60 years, Judah and Israel experience relative peace. Not much is going on politically in the area that would threaten Israel and Judah. And so also at the same time, there are very capable kings on the thrones of the northern kingdom of Israel, and that is Jeroboam II, and on the throne of Judah, and that is Uzziah, also known as Azariah in some biblical texts. Because the Arameans have stopped their incursions of the south, Arameans of Damascus, and also because the Assyrians are trying to take care of business at home for this roughly half a century, that gives these capable monarchs time to expand their borders, engage in a great deal of commerce, and they bring in a lot of wealth. But that wealth does not filter down to the lowest in society, the marginalized, the poor, the orphan, etc. In fact, Amos and especially Micah accuse all the leaders, every leader, merchants, princes, royal princes, prophets, priests, all with being guilty of gaining their wealth on the backs and the necks of the poor and the widow and the orphan, thereby violating the second tablet of the law, most definitely and directly. Micah, a later contemporary possibly of Amos, but Amos said these kinds of things first. God is not amused with oppression of those who are the least in society, those most vulnerable, and for Israel and Judah to make money, to make wealth, and to give power and privilege to those who have the ability to take it. God is not at all amused by, whether then or now. As a result of false attachment to the Torah and its teachings, which they teach, that God is on their side and for them and with them, even though they oppress the poor, the widow, and the orphan, God is saying through Amos to the northern kingdom of Israel that time is up. And in fact, there is very, very little hope in the book of Amos at all for any kind of a future for them. Perhaps a dim maybe. It's one of the most disturbing books of the Bible if you're looking for some sort of comforting word. There's very little of that in the book of Amos, and we'll get to that a little bit later. I mentioned the northern kingdom of Israel, capital in Samaria. You see that. Hopefully you can see that. Okay. Not bad. And then the southern kingdom of Judah. Borders expanded. More power and wealth than they had experienced since the time of Solomon. Oh, come on. Michelle, there we go. Amos is not, he calls himself in chapter 7, not a professional prophet, but rather a, maybe it's chapter 8, but rather a gentleman farmer and an orchard fig producer, as well as a shepherd. And he's introduced in the beginning of the book as one of the shepherds of the Judean town of Tekoa, some miles south of Jerusalem. What's he doing in North Israel? That's where he does all of his prophesying, is in the kingdom of North Israel. They are not amused to have him there either. As far as we can tell, he only prophesies at Jeroboam II's sanctuary at Bethel. Maybe over a very short period of time, where he is encouraged to leave as soon as possible. So, shepherd and fig farmer, that is basically what we know about him, other than his defense of his ministry to Amaziah the high priest, where he says, I am not a professional prophet. In other words, I'm not a member of the guild of professional prophets, but God took me from following the sheep, and he said, go prophesy against my people, Israel. This is, for what it's worth, Amos is very easily outlined. Not all biblical books are that easy. This one's real easy. It's basically got 4 or 5 major sections that are pretty easy to follow. And so I'm moving on. I'll raise this again as we go through. Amos 1:2. Let me read this. The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. If you want to know what a book is about, it's really helpful to read the introduction. This is an introductory hymn of God's destructive power. This book is about God's judgment over the northern kingdom of Israel. Almost unrelieved judgment coming from the Holy One of Israel, who has been offended by their attitude towards their religion, which is characterized as false, their worship is vain, and they're guilty of ill-gotten gain on the necks of the poor, as I mentioned before. The Lord roars from Zion, not from Samaria. So God is uttering his voice through the prophetic word in North Israel from Jerusalem. That prophetic word brings about judgment. The top of Carmel withers. As far as we know, Carmel, the mountain range, you see a picture of it here. It's really a mountain range, 5 or 10 miles in length, that juts out into the Mediterranean about 2/3 of the way up the coastline of modern-day Israel. You can see Carmel on the map. As far as we can tell, there was likely a religious, a cultic site on top of Carmel, and it is devastated, metaphorically here, by the utterance of the prophetic word through the mouth of Amos. And so the book is about God's judgment on their religion, God's judgment on their politics, God's judgment on their ethics in the northern kingdom of Israel. I'm not going to read hardly anything because there's no time, but verses 3 through of chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 8 is a sermon. I like to think that this was a sermon that Amos uttered in Bethel at the king's sanctuary. I like to think, I have no real solid evidence for this, but it's the kind of thing that would make them really, really upset. He begins with, it's a setup job really, he begins with very brief judgment oracles against every one of Israel's neighbors, and I have them sort of laid out here. This is probably going to be very, very difficult to read, but I give you the order from Damascus in the far north, and then down to the Philistines, then back up to the cities of Tyre and Sidon and Phoenicia, number 3. Number 4 is way down in Edom, and then it's sort of back and forth all throughout. The last 2 are Judah and then finally Israel. All of their kings, their nations are guilty of atrocities, the kinds of things that ought never to happen because they are bloody and outrageous atrocities committed by the rulers of these lands. And specifics are given. I'm not going to take the time to read them. But they begin each with, for 3 transgressions of fill in the blank, Damascus. And for 4. Well, that doesn't mean that he can't decide if it's 3 or 4. It's for repeated atrocities, for many atrocities. I will not return it, is what it says in the Hebrew. I won't bring it back. What is that? Bring back his judgment is what almost every translation will say. And I think that's appropriate. God will not revoke the judgment or cause it to return, but rather it is sure because of their atrocities. As atrocious and outrageous as the sin of these nations may be, in chapter 2, the sin of Judah in verses 4 and 5 is worse, because they who have been given the Torah have rejected Torah. They have not kept the statutes of the Lord, but they have believed in lies, and so God is going to send judgment upon them. I like to think that Amos's audience in Bethel, right across the border from Judah, in the northern kingdom, one of Jeroboam II's 2 sanctuaries, the high place at Bethel, is where I think likely he delivered this sermon, and his audience is with him all the way. You know, isn't it true that all these nations have been so evil, and Judah, the worst of them, our southern neighbor, you know, our brothers, they're the worst. But it's a setup job, because in verses 6 through 8, he springs the trap. For 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not cause it to turn back. That is his punishment. Because they are worse. These are the things that in most law codes of the ancient world are always considered the worst things you could do. And that is defraud and oppress the orphan and the widow. The poor is among the worst things that kings in the ancient world say that they don't do. They safeguard the rights even when they don't. They say that they do. And so the very worst things that one can do, they are guilty of. They sell the righteous for silver, the needy for a pair of shoes. They trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth. Turn aside the way of the afflicted. A man and his father go into the same maid, and so my holy name is profaned. And so forth. So they're the worse. They're the guiltier of all of them. Verses 9 to the end of the chapter are the things God did for them, rehearsing their past, all the gracious acts God had done in their history, and yet they did not respond to that grace. We don't even need to look at this. What is the purpose of oracles against the nations? Obviously, it's maybe all three of these, a warning to Judah and Israel. These are probably not a message of hope for them. Amos 3 through 6, woes on Israel, chapter 3, for wealth, for conspicuous consumption, we might call it, and for oppression of the poor. This begins in verse 2, "You only have I known from all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you." Covenant is for responsibility, not for privilege alone, and that's a lesson that they had not learned. Verses 9 and following, "Proclaim to the strongholds in Assyria, the strongholds in Egypt, assemble yourselves, see the great tumults within her, the oppressions in her midst. They do not know how to do right. They store up violence and robbery." Verse 12, one of the most chilling verses in the whole book. "Can Israel be saved? Is there hope for North Israel? Thus says the Lord, as a shepherd rescues from the mouth of the lion 2 legs and a piece of an ear, so shall Israel be saved." If you can call that salvation. A couple of barely saved people almost drowned in a hurricane that crawl up on the beach, if you can call that salvation. That's the hope in the book of Amos for the northern kingdom of Israel. I'll qualify that, but not a lot. It is a pretty dim book. "On the day I punish Israel for his transgressions," verse 14, "I will punish the altars of Bethel. The horns of the altar shall be cut off and fall to the ground." False worship. "I will smite the winter house and summer house. The houses of ivory shall perish." Okay, this, by the way, is ruins of Samaria. I don't know why I threw that in there. Some people think that Amos made it all the way to Samaria. I'm dubious. These are Samaria ivories. This ivory palaces that Amos talks about. For a long time, people thought that was hyperbole, and yet we have discovered in Samaria many ivory carvings, conspicuous consumption, whether then or now, a sign of conspicuous wealth. This is not found in Israel, but found in Cyprus, but it's the kind of thing Amos talks about. It is an ivory bed that was discovered a little earlier than the passages we're talking about in the country of Cyprus. So such things were done, and God is not amused by how they gain and how they dispose of their wealth. Chapter 4, against oppressive women and again false worship. God's punishment is supposed to bring about repentance at the end of the chapter, but it didn't work. What does he say about the women? Calls them you cows of Bashan, sort of very fertile region known as the Golan Heights in Israel today. Very fertile with apparently big fat cows, right? These are women called, they, I'm sure, were not amused by such characterization, and it wasn't intended to amuse them. Who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring that we may drink. It says, because of this, the last of you is going to go into exile, carried out on a line with fishhooks through your skin. And that is exactly the kind of thing that happened. There's a relationship between worship and ethics. Verse 4, come to Bethel and transgress, when they go to Bethel to worship at the sanctuary there. Go to Gilgal and multiply transgressions. One of Israel's earliest shrine, in fact, in the land of Israel was at Gilgal. Bring your sacrifices, your tithes. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving of that which is leavened. Proclaim freewill offerings. Publish them, for so you love to do, O people of Israel. If there is not compassion on the poor, the needy, the orphan, the widow, the vulnerable, if there is no observance of loving neighbor as one loves oneself, then one's worship is vain, whether that's among New Testament believers or among people of the 8th century BC. Chapter 5 is a funeral dirge, simply a funeral dirge, a funeral song that is given to, that's ruins at Bethel, by the way. We don't have the high place at Bethel. We've not uncovered it, but we have uncovered Jeroboam II's high place at Dan, or rather Jeroboam I's high place that was still in use at the time of Jeroboam II. These are pictures of wailing women, professional mourners that Amos calls upon to come and mourn and grieve Israel's demise. This is a parody of a funeral song, most of chapter 5, a parody of a funeral song. And so they're called upon to invoke a dirge, a kinah in Hebrew, to wail Israel's demise. Well, Israel is wealthier and more powerful than they had been since the time of Solomon. And so they were not particularly taken by this message and asked him to leave because of speaking this sort of message. But within 1 to 2 generations, it happens exactly as Amos has said. And they are carted away into exile, never to return. Now, again, I will qualify that. I'm going to stop here in just a minute. I'll qualify that a little bit next week. In fact, a piece of a leg and an ear is all that's left of North Israel that comes out of exile. And so we'll look at that a little bit next week. Let me stop there. I'll run over a little more of this, talk about the message and the message of the New Testament message, how this is still a timely lesson. I'm convinced that the message of the 8th century prophets is extremely relevant, possibly more relevant for the age in which we live now than any other age subsequent to this. I think it speaks to us directly with words I think that we continue to need to hear. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Mark. Let's close by singing together a song of, in a sense, a prayer that the sort of things, the selfishness, the self-centeredness, the greed that we saw, that Amos saw and spoke against will not be a part of us, not be who we are as God's people today. This is a prayer. Would you mind standing for this and our closing benediction in just a moment? So let's sing together. Make me a